Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to be working with such a distinguished panel for I think will be a very interesting conversation. First, let me wish you all well. I hope everyone is healthy and happy during this very unusual period. We are all, of course, still in the middle of this pandemic, during which we are working in very different ways. For many of us, it's been a very unique experience. When we think about this pandemic, we also recognize that it has had significant impacts on economies around the world. And there's a lot of discussion about what can be done to recover from the economic impacts of the pandemic, but also to prepare for the long-term future. In that respect, we have produced a series of policy briefs that highlight how nuclear can play a role in both the near-term economic recovery from the pandemic, but also looking longer term. We think it's very important to consider that the opportunity to make investments in infrastructure shouldn't be made it should not be made in an impatient way. It should be done in a way that looks at the long-term future. And when we think about the long-term future, energy security, energy reliability, environmental concerns should really be at the top of our concerns. And in that respect, nuclear can play a very strong and important role. And these policy briefs highlight that. We've benefited very much from our cooperation with the World Nuclear Association in putting these policy briefs together, because it reflects a lot of information that's available to the industry. But this is not really a matter of just the economics of the industry. It really is looking at the long-term policies that the economies will need to provide electricity for their people in the long-term future. And as we recognize, electricity has become really one of the most important factors in economic development and growth that we will see in the future as we become more electrified with electric vehicles, with more in-depth parts of industry using electricity. So this is something that we think is very important. And to talk about this today, I'm very pleased to have this panel, which will give us a very different views from government, from regulators, from industry, about how all these factors come into play. To give an overview of our policy brief, I would like to ask Sama Bilbao-Nulon, who is our head of division for nuclear technology and economics, to give an overview. So Sama, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. It is my pleasure to present a brief summary of the policy brief that we are going to discuss in depth today, which is related to the resiliency of the electricity system for nuclear. As Bill said, I really want to thank the support that we have received, the collaboration that we have had with the World Nuclear Association to put together these briefs. So next slide, please. I'm going to start by defining what is resiliency. It's a word that we have been using quite often these days, but I'm not sure that all of us truly know what resiliency means. So I have here the definition that is provided by the OECD. So resiliency is the capacity to withstand and bounce back for major disruptions. And a resilient system, they are planned to prevent, avoid, withstand, and absorb any threats, and also to recover and adapt in the aftermath of a disruption. So I think it's very important to highlight all the different elements that are included in resiliency. So when we go to the next slide, we actually look a little bit more in detail at the three main dimensions that we are going to encounter in resilient electricity systems. So first of all, we need to consider the physical availability of the actual generating capacity. So that's clearly the first component. But beyond that, we really need to look at the contribution of the different capacity generation to the smooth operation of the overall electricity system as a whole. regardless of any sudden shifts in demand or any changes in weather or anything else. And then finally, and just as important, is the contribution of this generation capacity to the stable economic behavior of the systems. This means to make sure that the prices of electricity aren't volatile and that we can predict to some extent what is going to be the cost and the price of electricity. And then just as important is to make sure that this resiliency requires long-term planning, and also it needs to be at a regional level in addition to the national level. So let's go to the next slide and perhaps explore why nuclear power plants are actually a clear example of resilient facilities. Of course, the resiliency of nuclear power plants is the result of a combination of high levels of safety, operational flexibility, and also the continuous learning that the industry and the sector prides itself of. So by design and also beyond design, nuclear power plants are always following the principles of defense in depth, prevention, protection, mitigation, and we take into account the use of redundant, independent, and diversified systems that are going to allow these facilities to withstand any external hazards. But beyond the technical resiliency, the technical design, there is also an organizational perspective that makes nuclear power plants quite resilient. And this means that we are incorporating from the very beginning principles such as emergency preparedness and all kinds of contingency plans to rapidly identify any critical activities that need to be done and to maintain normal operations even with limited personnel, as we have been doing during this COVID. So I think that is quite, I think you all know that current nuclear systems and the operations themselves have been refined through many years, and we have been taking into account the evolving regulatory environments. We are always taking advantage of the most up-to-date, the newest information, the newest technical information in order to continuously adapt the system and the operational procedures. Also, I want to highlight that nuclear power plants provide resiliency at the biggest, at a bigger level, at a system level. As we know, in order to ensure that a system is resilient, we really need to have a balanced and diversified power mix. And within that power mix, we really need to have dispatchable and flexible electricity, such as what nuclear power plants produce, which is a perfect complement to the variable electricity that is provided by renewables and others. But in addition to the actual energy, nuclear power plants are huge contributors to grid stability. So nuclear power plants provide inertia, reactive capacity, frequency control, etc., that are indispensable to make sure that the grid is going to continue to remain stable. Then finally, I want to be yet one more component of nuclear power plants, and is the socio-economic reliability. To begin with, the fact that nuclear power plants provide competitive electricity prices to the customers is clearly the first input to help with the overall economy and the social growth. But also, nuclear power plants provide stable, local, high-paying jobs, so that is quite significant. But not only that, nuclear power plants, they typically result in major economic spillovers not only in the local area, but in the region and in the nation. So let's go back to the next slide, and let's look at why nuclear energy is going to be a key component to support the development of a low carbon resilient electricity infrastructure, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. So in the short term, we see that long-term operation provides a shovel-ready opportunity to strengthen electricity infrastructures. We have currently around the world more than 100 reactors that are operating beyond 40 years. This means that this gives us a perfect opportunity to extend the life of these facilities that are providing electricity at a cost-effective and reliable manner, and then we can continue to use them for a little bit longer time. But in addition to that, we also have the opportunity to use nuclear new build. In many Western countries, we are reaching a higher level in the learning curve for these first-of-a-kind projects, and we think that the conditions are now perfect to use these proven technologies to expand and grow the reliable and resilient clean electricity grids. So of course, these two things are going to result in an investment efficiency. Essentially, we are going to be able to use technologies that allow us to spend less money in building this reliable and resilient infrastructure by at the same time achieving the low carbon goals that we all have. And of course, we will take advantage of the technology and socioeconomical spillovers that I mentioned earlier. So let me conclude very quickly in the next slide with maybe our three key messages. We feel that this COVID crisis presents us with a perfect opportunity in all countries in the world to build modern, resilient, low carbon energy infrastructure. And we really want to highlight the long-term perspective of developing this infrastructure. So this is a long-term endeavor that necessitates technology-neutral policy actions that need to be thoughtfully and carefully designed to make the most of these stimulus packages that many countries are proposing. Also, we want to highlight that large infrastructure projects have proven in the past to be a formidable tool to reignite the economy and to achieve some social cohesion, to rally up the social the society around a potential opportunity to reignite the economy. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, and is very clearly explained in our briefs, nuclear energy, both new nuclear and existing and the long-term operation of the existing nuclear power plants provide a key opportunity for the post-COVID economic recovery, because we can boost the economy in the short term, and also we can support in a cost-effective manner the development of a low-carbon resilient electricity infrastructure for the longer term. So with this, I turn the floor back to you, Mr. Magwood, to start the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and appreciate that overview. So to discuss some of these issues from different perspectives, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very distinguished panel. I'll introduce them as they speak. I'll give them each about 5 minutes to give comments, and then we'll have some dialogue. The very first, and always a pleasure to welcome him to visit with us, a very close colleague, the State Secretary responsible for maintaining the capacity of the Paks nuclear power plant in Hungary, Mr. Paul Kovacs. He's both has training as an engineer and an economist, and earlier in his career, he was also an alum of the Nuclear Energy Agency. So it's always a great pleasure to welcome you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Magwood. Good afternoon, everybody. Madam Bilbao, in her presentation, formulated the sentence that the nuclear energy can play an important role. Well, in our case, actually, it's not only can play, but actually plays an important role in boosting the economy and providing stability to the electricity supply, at least in the Hungarian context. So probably you know that, you may know that in Hungary we have one nuclear power plant with 4 units of VVR 440s that are operating, that are producing at an electric power capacity of 2,000 megawatts as such. And they are providing about 50% of the domestic generation and 1/3 of the domestic electricity consumption. Those units were designed in the 60s, constructed in the 70s, and started their operation in the 80s. This is one of the most important assets in Hungary, and the government decided early in the 2011 that this nuclear industry and nuclear energy should play an important role in the future energy mix of Hungary. So we decided as well to extend the lifetime of the nuclear power. So a new nuclear power plant is to be built on the same site as Paks. So we do plan to construct 2 new units as well. So the capacity replacement in the 2030s will be already in place in Hungary. So our major dilemma in the Hungarian market and the Hungarian electricity energy system is how to ensure 100% supply security for electricity. So you may know that Hungary is very limited in energy resources, especially we do not have hydro for the regulation of the system. So in the COVID time, we have learned a lot of lessons from there. On the left-hand side, you see the development of the gross consumption and generation the first half of 2019 comparing to 2020. And what you can see is that in 2020, we have had lower consumption than the previous year. However, the consumption that was met by the domestic electricity production resulted a decrease in the import rate, and where we have had the lowest value in April caused by the COVID in the consumption, still the result was that the net import decreased drastically, and on the right hand side figure you can see that Hungary was in a much less import dependent state in the COVID times than before. So we can say that there were no major decrease in the electricity consumption in the country. Nevertheless, the nuclear has helped to improving the security of supply and decreasing the same time the dependence on electricity import. So we may say that the low carbon generation was resistant to the COVID, and the major contributor to this was the nuclear energy. Please show the next slide, where you can see that with the blue line, nuclear was a stable producer of electricity, and combined with the renewable energy resources, we achieved in April, where we had the lowest consumption rate, relatively lowest consumption rate, the combination of the CO2-free energy resources, we have achieved a high level of security of supply for electricity. So there were 2 contributions. One is the CO2-free contribution of the nuclear power and the renewable energy sector. And I can tell that for the right corner, you see those the result of the first half of this year of the carbon-free generation in the first half in Hungary. That has shown that the low carbon production share has achieved 61.5% and 82.7% thanks to nuclear power. And you can see the rest, the wind generation, the solar photovoltaic generation, and else. So we can conclude that in some 96.7% of electricity consumption was resistant to the COVID, and the major supplier source of decarbonization that provided decarbonization and stability and inertia to the Hungarian electricity grid, where it was thanks to the nuclear energy production. Yes, we want to avoid grid disruptions that we have experienced the last year that they become more and more frequent in the Hungarian electricity grid. You may know that in the neighborhood of Hungary, there are two regions that are really in danger regarding electricity supply. So in the last 2 decades, we have had two military conflicts in the region, one in the east and one in the south. So the stability at the edge of the European Union is a bit different. So the comfortability feeling regarding the security of supply issue is completely different than in other parts of Europe. So please have in mind that for us, security of supply is extremely important. Next slide, please. So concluding, for the long term, the Hungarian government decided to deal with the nuclear energy for a longer time period till the end of this century. So I'm happy to again present that we have just submitted the implementation license application for the PAX2 units, which is the extension of the existing unit. And this way, we hope that the 73,000 pages of the implementation license agreement and the 210,000 pages as a background documentation will be enough to establish the stable future for a cost-competitive nuclear technology till the end of this century, high qualification jobs in the future, and a resilient electricity infrastructure in the eastern part of Europe. So this is why I thank you. I want to conclude, and I'm looking forward for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Maybe just a couple of quick questions, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. And so what do you expect to see in terms of the generation of jobs as a result of this project? What kind of numbers are you expecting?
Originally, PAX before the current units was a very small village of 6,000 inhabitants. Now the town has 20,000 inhabitants. Our expectations that with the extension of the PAX plant, only in the town will have an impact of about 10 to 15,000 inhabitants more. But in the region, it will have much, much more impact, having in mind that the region is developing in parallel with the power plant as well. So it's a minimum 15, 20,000 more jobs are created in the region because of the extension of the power plant.
Yes, and I imagine, and that sounds very similar to other stories I've heard, and I imagine many of those jobs would be very high-paying jobs.
Yes, you are right, you are right. Well, PAX became a regional center now. So as of culture, if we are speaking about culture, tourism, sports, and the clean air, you know, what we have in the region, which is not comparable to other heavy industrial centers. So we have clean air in that region of the power plant, which provides an excellent opportunity as well for the wine producers. So, and I stop here.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably an aspect of the construction of nuclear plants that even we really haven't given a lot of thought to, is how much the construction of a nuclear power plant in an area actually transforms the area entirely. There actually, as I think about it, there's a very good story in the United States where I'm from, in the construction of a plant in Maryland, the Calvert Cliffs plant, which was built in an area that was relatively poor, rural area. But after the plant was built, you know, had some of the best schools in the state and tremendous infrastructure. Has just really transformed the area. So there's probably a story there that that hasn't really been explained in great detail. So this will be very interesting to watch how this develops. One last quick question. What do you see? Based on what you've seen from this COVID crisis, and you mentioned the possibility of instability from wars or other things on the edges of the European Union, but what do you see as the most serious long-term reliability issue that Hungary faces when it comes to electricity supply?
Well, with the introduction of the intermittent renewable energy sources, we see that the stability of the system is kind of decreasing. So there are more and more issues and near misses in the system adequacy problems in the past years. And just a good example, last year on January the 25th, we had a situation where the Hungarian consumption rate was 7,105 megawatts, and the contribution to that consumption rate by the installed renewable solar capacity, installed capacity was 1,200 megawatts. We have only got 9 megawatts out of it on the same day. And the contribution of wind was 96. So altogether, they only went over 100 when the requirement 100 megawatt capacity when the consumption rate was 7,105. So I mean, without a nuclear power, we would be in an extremely tough situation. So import and nuclear may not be the best combination to delivering security of supply. So I mean, we need to find really in this region a solution which largely would contribute to delivering security of supply, having in mind that there are not so stable regions in the neighborhood. This is the largest dilemma in the region.
Thank you very much for that. So we're getting questions from the audience, so we'll come back and we'll have a few more questions for you at the end. But let me now introduce the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Ramina Velshi. Dr. Velshi was nominated for a 5-year term beginning August 22nd, 2018, and has a long association with the Commission. She was a commissioner beginning 2011. She has extensive technical and regulatory background, having worked in various capacities, electric utilities, also as a served board member of Ontario Hydro's Energy Board, the economic regulator of the Ontario electricity and natural gas sectors. She also is most recent NEA leadership star that we had an issue of a very nice report. It's very popular, by the way, Ramina. We get lots of demand for that, lots of downloads. And so President Velshi is a very close friend of the NEA, and it's a great pleasure to have her with us today to give a regulatory perspective to these issues. So President Velshi, the floor is yours.
Hey, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, Director General Magwood. I'm so glad we've been able to continue with important gatherings such as this event in the midst of a global pandemic. As the head of Canada's independent and impartial nuclear regulator, I cannot say much about building electricity infrastructure resilience and the role that nuclear energy could or should play. However, I think it is appropriate and accurate for me to say that nuclear facilities, including those, especially those in Canada, are resilient and have become even more resilient through the years. That increased resiliency is in large part due to the commitment regulators and operators have made to embracing the principles of lessons learned and continuous improvement. Post 9/11, we agreed that being able to vigorously defend these nuclear facilities from malevolent acts was a key priority. After Fukushima, the importance of addressing and pre-positioning emergency mitigating equipment became clear, and we regularly exercise and collaborate on simulated emergencies. We welcome peer experts from around the world to review what we do and recommend how we can do better, and we are committed to a strong safety culture. Equally important, our embrace of defense in depth encourages us to be prepared for the unthinkable, which the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima accidents showed does sometimes occur. Defense in depth is a common priority for regulators and operators around the world, especially in our safety analysis. And it is epitomized in the Canadian context in the dual shutdown systems in Canada's CANDO technology. But a perspective and a dimension that is not often discussed when it comes to resiliency, in my opinion, is the important concept of building trust and confidence in the safe regulation and operation of the nuclear sector within the public. The public wants assurance that in our pursuit of ensuring safety, we are committed to cooperating, sharing information, and engaging in two-way communication. And this is especially important during this pandemic. While there is a great history of collaboration within the nuclear sector, both nationally and internationally, to understand and address safety and environmental issues, more can and must be done to bring those on the outside who are interested and genuinely concerned into the discussion. That expanded conversation will be even more important as advanced nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors are proposed. If not done well, it can result in stalled or delayed or canceled nuclear projects, as happened recently in Canada with the cancellation of a proposed deep geological repository for the disposal of low and intermediate level radioactive waste. Although the science supported the safety case, there was not sufficient community support for the project, and the proponent therefore canceled the project after undergoing more than a 15-year regulatory process. I have long believed that Canada's nuclear licensing and regulatory processes are some of the most open, transparent, thorough, and accommodating ones in the world. International peers have confirmed this. We welcome all perspectives to the table and often provide funding to support public participation. This provides a form of defense in depth by ensuring that all relevant information is considered and nothing is overlooked. Building and maintaining public trust has been a top priority of mine since joining the CNSC. And we conducted polling for the first time ever in February this year to see the level of public confidence in us, the regulator. That polling largely confirmed that there is confidence in the CNSC as the nuclear regulator. It, however, also highlighted areas where we could do better. Those areas related primarily to a lack of adequate consultation of communities, particularly during the time in between licenses, and a perceived lack of adequate independence of the regulator from industry. These findings have motivated us to rethink approaches to trust building based on shared values, more meaningful participation, better listening, and continuous evaluation. We are committed to doing better going forward. This includes revisiting how our commission proceedings are conducted and exploring the use of technologies to better engage with stakeholders and Indigenous groups, even during these unprecedented times. Through these efforts, we hope to encourage greater information sharing and collaboration amongst the public, the regulator, and the regulated community. Our commitment is to include everyone with an interest in our processes so that all information and perspectives are considered. This will hopefully result in confidence that the best informed decision is taken in every instance while building public trust in the CNSC as Canada's nuclear regulator and our commitment to safety above all else. I believe that having public trust, especially in the regulator, is a prerequisite to nuclear energy having a role in the post-COVID-19 era and a priority that everyone in the nuclear sector should continue working towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And let me ask you if, and perhaps you're telegraphing this a little bit, but do you believe that the role of regulators, certainly not in every country, but in many countries, is beginning to evolve in terms of communication with the public? Do you feel like that things are starting to move in a different direction in terms of how regulators have to engage the public, and not just providing information, but really dialoguing. What's your thought about that?
I can't speak for all regulators, but certainly many of the regulators, you know, the UK in particular comes to mind. I think we're both in the same space, that we really do need to change the way we dialogue, communicate, engage with our public and stakeholders and our Indigenous communities. And the way we were doing business, which was very much focused during licensing times, and then there would be this enormous effort of engaging at that time, is simply not adequate and does not build the kind of confidence that's required. But I think that recognition that the way we used to do is not sufficient today, I think is slowly being realized by everyone. And there is a fair bit of movement, and I'm certainly collaborating with my sister regulators to make sure we can work together in this very important area. And we've got a lot to learn from some of our other regulators who are many steps ahead of us when it comes to building trust, in particular the Scandinavian countries, I find.
I wonder, you know, one of the precepts of regulation that we certainly followed when I was a commissioner with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was that we made decisions on the technical basis, and that we issued our decision based on the technology, based on the law, and we explained it to the public, and then that was our responsibility in large respect. I get the sense in many countries that's starting to change to where that's not enough, that there has to be a back and forth, a dialogue, an accommodation to the public. And you know, I know you probably don't want to talk specifically about the nuclear waste issue in Canada, but when you see projects like that with so much technical work that's been done not be successful, is it because we didn't communicate it well enough, or that we should have dialogued with the public to reach an understanding about what their concerns were and accommodate them to the degree possible, and maybe slightly change the decision based on that in order to have a successful project? That's a very different role for regulators, and that's something that most regulators are not equipped to do, quite frankly.
Right, so I can't, again, I agree, I can't speak to that specific project, but I do want to make it clear that our decisions will still be science and evidence-based. It's just, how do we engage, how do we understand what the different perspectives are, what the different concerns are, and how do we make sure that we are adequately addressing those concerns? And it's not so much the concerns we hear is that even when we allow and engage people in different civil society organizations in our proceedings, when we make our decisions, we don't adequately address their concerns and how we disposition their concerns. And so they don't feel heard. I'm not saying the decisions would have been different, but I think we need to do a much better job. And it's also about building relationships, and relationships can't be built just during the licensing process. It has to be over time and understanding where each one is coming from. And so I think we know what needs to be done. We're not quite sure how yet to do it, but we do know that something absolutely has to happen.
I think this is a conversation that we really have to advance, because it's making our lives, as lives of regulators, a lot more complex than it used to be. And as I said, and you know, we have groups within the NEA that work on regulatory communications, basically. And it's occurred to me as we've watched these groups evolve that was the right conversation 10 years ago, but may not be the right conversation today, because it's not just about public communications. It's much more complex than that. And I think we have not quite found the language to figure out how to discuss this. So it's probably something that, you know, perhaps I'll consult with you about that. It's something we should pursue. One last question. Now that we've had this pandemic, one of the things that's really quite interesting about it, both for regulators and for the public, is that we talk about the pandemic as a risk, but we also have the language in the nuclear industry and the nuclear sector talking about risk. And I wonder, do you think that the relative risks, and I know this comes up in everyday life from the regulators when we talk about whether to send inspectors to a plant, for example, how do you feel like this issue about the relative risk of pandemic versus nuclear risk has been communicated, both inside the regulatory organization and also to the public? How do you feel that that's proceeded?
So I don't think there's been much done at all about the relative risk from the pandemic, say, versus nuclear risk. But I think, and I'll address your question a little differently in that I think the pandemic, and I am one for taking any crisis and seeing how we can make opportunities out of it and not waste it. I think the pandemic has actually heightened the public's awareness of risk. And, when we talk about safety culture, we talk about, as my French colleague said this week, we talk about the operator's safety culture, we talk about the regulator's safety culture, we really talk about the public safety culture. And I think the pandemic has brought that to the forefront for the public. What are the risks? How am I weighing, many of it is following directions that come from public health officials, but how am I weighing the risks and benefits, and what kind of decisions am I making in protecting myself and my community? And I think this will really help us as we talk about nuclear risk versus the actual risk versus perceived risk, that now we actually have the pandemic risk, that we can put it within that context and help explain how it fits within that. So I really see great opportunities with that. Us in Canada as the nuclear regulator certainly have not gone out to the public in talking about pandemic risk versus nuclear radiation risk. But I think it's given us the groundwork to build on now.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. And we have questions coming in, so we will have some more for you in a few minutes. But let me move on to Johan Svenningsson. I hope I got close to that. Who serves as CEO and country chairman of Uniper Sweden since 2015. He holds position as CEO, COO, chairman, deputy chairman, and member of the boards of directors across major Swedish energy and nuclear power groups, including Sidkraft AB, the Swedish waste management company, Oskarshamn, Barsebäck, Ringwalls, Forsmark nuclear power plants. He's also governor in the World Association of Nuclear Operators, as well as a board member of the World Nuclear Association. You sound like you must be a very busy man, so we greatly appreciate you spending time with us today. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Magwood. And it's a pleasure for me to participate here and also in this panel, especially now in these times of the COVID-19 and both handling the crisis right now in our operating fleets, but also how do we look forward, not like the policy briefs that you and also the WNA has provided here to really see how we can build a stronger society going forward. And I will start with a few slides here and then take some questions. So please go to the next slide. I think this picture, I think most of us knows this and know what it looks like, but I think it's really important now to remember this when we look forward to the post-COVID-19. What is really the system requirements? And this is taken from a Swedish context where we say that we should be carbon neutral by 2045. And that is not only in the electrical sector, because we are already carbon neutral or fossil free in the electrical sector, with our nuclear power providing about 40%, hydropower about 50%, and wind about 10%. But the next step is also how to decarbonize the transport sector and the industry sector, where we know that the electricity demand is going to be significant. If we look in Sweden, we're talking about a growth rate of about 30% to take out the carbon out of industry and transportation. And to do that, we really need a resilient and strong electricity system. In combination with the growth of about 60 terawatt hours, we also see that if we do not do a long-term further lifetime extension of our nuclear fleets more than 60 years, the total retirement of nuclear, wind, and CHPs is about 100 terawatt hours. So up to 2045, we would need to build about 150 terawatt hours of electricity system, which is actually the size of the Swedish system today. So that's a huge challenge just by itself. But we also know that we need a high degree of security of supply. I think we take it for granted now, the last decades in the western parts of the world, that we do have a very strong security of supply and that our electricity system is delivering. And if we look on the Swedish context, there we see that the nuclear build-up that we did from the 70s and forward has really provided us with a stable, secure electricity system. It was in the middle of the oil crisis in 72, 73, where our first plant came online, Oskarshamn 1. And then we built 12 units in about 13 years, added about 60 terawatt hours of nuclear power. And that has provided us with both fossil-free electricity, very stable electricity supply, but also at a low cost. And I think if we look in the post-COVID-19 era, this is exactly what we want to have. And it's also stimulated the economy because we have had a very significant growth of the economy. Then one item that we actually tends to forget is the high degree of resilience. I mean, we do need to handle all different types of crises and disturbances, and also be able to restore the grid after a blackout. And where we are going, and I'm going to show some pictures about that in Sweden, if we continue the path we're going now, we are actually opening up for these types of crises and disturbances, and also the lack of capability of restoring the grid if we continue to shut down the nuclear power plants that has been started. We had the event in London last year, or Britain, where we had a blackout in parts of UK, which really showed that how quickly it can go when you lose electricity supply. And then in the end, I think that is also an item that we take it for granted, but in the post-COVID-19 area is going to be really critical for us, is that we need to have a competitive price for the end customer. And that is the system cost. We usually meet the arguments about the low cost of building onshore wind, and also offshore wind is coming down quite dramatically, and photovoltaic is also dropping in prices significantly, which is good. We all need all fossil-free energy sources. But this means also that we need more grids, we need stability mechanism, we need balancing services. So the total system cost goes up, and we really need to focus on the economies going forward when we see all the money that is spending now to handle the COVID-19 crisis. Could move to the next slide, please. What's happened now in Sweden, and that is driven by the policies that has been set by the government, with the quite rapid change of the electrical system. We have had through the electrical certificate system or green certificates, a very large increase of the wind expansion. And both due to permitting and also for the positioning where there's good places with the wind, much of that has been happening in the northern parts of Sweden. But there is also where we have the majority of our hydro fleet, and also the demand is low because the demand is centered more in the south. And the south, we at the same time had closed down. Now it's 5 nuclear power plants, and the 6th is going to be taken out now in the end of the year. And we have not built out the transmission grid. Since this policy change has gone so fast, and the expansion of the production capacity has gone so fast, we see that we probably have about a 20-year lead time until we have a full transmission grid built out. A little bit like the German situation with the grid expansion in Germany. And this, of course, creates a lot of imbalances in the system and lock-in effects, which both get a system stability issue, but also from a price perspective, where we have really threatens the competitiveness of both nuclear power in the south and hydropower in the north. Take the next slide, please. The other impact that we see, and we also see the effects coming now, is that with the closure of the nuclear power plants, we also see that the inertia decreases, which make it a much less resilient system. And we can see that the majority of the inertia is now in the southern parts of Sweden and in Finland, in the Nordic system. But by closing down the nuclear units, we can see that the trend of the inertia is going down. And actually, the lowest inertia periods, the prognosis in 2025 is that we go below the risk boundary. which is then opening up then for the risk of blackouts and also grid disturbances. And then if you can restore the grid, it could create a quite difficult situation. Take the next one. And I think one lessons learned, I think that goes also from the COVID-19, but also now from the changes of the electricity system, is that it goes very quick to be able to destroy a system, but takes very long time to restore it. And also the political and media debate is also shifting very fast. These are two clips from the Swedish newspapers, and I don't think you're fluent in Swedish, so I will translate them for you. That in 2019, that was in the left-hand side, it was a lot of headlines in the media talking about the closure of the two Ringhals plants, and there was clear statements saying there's not going to be any risk for electricity shortage. We will have an overproduction, which is true over the year, since we have a quite large wind production. But momentarily, we will have difficulties to provide the right amount of electricity. But in 19, all the media was focused on that we have an oversupply of electricity. On the right-hand side, on 2020, the headlines is that there's a risk that we could have a blackout in Sweden this summer, that the prices are skyrocketing. We have had prices up to like 20 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and it's been really high prices. And this is a shift in just 1 year that has happened. And we all know that an electricity system needs a much more longer planning and also political support to be competitive. Take the next one. And actually, just a few weeks ago, we came to the point here with the current system that we have in Sweden, that we have decided together with Vattenfall to optimize the remaining lifetime of Ringhals 1, that the unit was shut down during the summer because of the need for electricity was low, and it's going to run the last cycle during the fall. However, due to the risk for the system breakdown and lack of inertia, the Swedish TSO just contracted Ringhals 1 for a contract of 30 million to run during the summer just to stabilize the grid. And this was something that we have been talking about as an industry for probably the last 5-10 years, that this would be the effects of the changes of the system, but not until we come in the actual crisis mode, this is happening. And I think just to summarize, I think all these aspects is really putting the point to the need to protect the system and also the nuclear power, how important it is for the total system, both to provide the security of supply, but also to provide the fossil free and also to be able to support the society during the post-COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And let me start where you ended and to talk about Ringhals a little bit. So maybe you can give us some perspective. What do you feel, because as you said, the industry had been talking about the risk to the electricity system for years before it became a crisis, but it was only when the crisis was on the doorstep that action was taken. What is it that happens in the conversations in government and industry that makes it so difficult to communicate what the industry sees as simply facts to policymakers and the people who are making the decisions? Where is the communication breakdown?
I think, and it goes a little bit similar to we talk about the nuclear waste and the final repositories. It is to really, for us as an industry, to really portray both the long-term consequences and that the policies and the politics and governments needs to take the long-term perspective and do not have to look at just one period of election. In Sweden, this is 4 years. We all know politics is difficult, and I don't envy my political friends because it's really difficult to manage in the current political landscape. But I think we as an industry have not been good enough to really point to the long-term effects of certain parts of decisions. And I think that's going to be a continuous challenge in the political landscape we have, the media landscape where we have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram that is driving actually policies almost in the minute scale. And I think we have to look as an industry, how can we communicate this in a better manner? And in that respect, I think actually the COVID-19 crisis will help us. because we can see that things change very quickly and have large impacts on society. And the debate that has started to be within the authorities and politics in Sweden is how you look on import and export. We're building a system, electrical system, which is much more integrated. And for the last, I would say, 5-10 years, people talk about we should always rely on import. Each country should do that. Well, in the COVID-19 crisis, we can see that with the lockdowns of countries, that import and export may not work. And if we talk about electricity, today there is no one that talks about that we should lock down the cables between countries or from the Nordics down to the northern parts of Europe. But if it would come in a crisis, how would politics react? And will we also then lock down the possibility for import and export? And that's an emerging discussion that is coming in Sweden. So I think these type of long-term discussions will have a better base and a better possibility now in the coming years that we could probably capitalize as a business, especially the nuclear business, which is a long-term business.
Yeah. Do you feel that, when you said that, it occurred to me that I often hear when I talk to different officials in countries, they have a lot of confidence that being attached to the European grid provides them with security. But then it gives me the impression that many of them are expecting to have imported electricity. And there's a problem if everyone's expecting imports to save them in the future in case there's a shortfall. That there eventually there's not enough export to supply the imports. And so, do you feel like that this is a conversation that really isn't just a Swedish conversation, really a European conversation that really needs to become more long-term in its view and worry more about stability and reliability?
I think that will emerge. I think that discussion, I mean, it's taking place. We as an industry are trying to drive that, but I think that discussion will emerge, and I think it is very vital. And there, I think the nuclear industry and the nuclear power is a critical element, because there we could have stable electricity supply locally. It's locally produced. You could say within the country. It's fossil free, so it will fight climate change. Climate change has kind of gone down a little bit on the agenda, but I'm sure that will come back to be very high on the agenda. And I think that will give the possibility to look more regionally or nationally on the electricity production, still being able to export and import, but to build that resilience in the national system. I think that will be a good opportunity, because if we look at, we do not have a completely integrated grid in Europe, but if you look for different regions, and we talk about northern parts of Europe, if there is a high pressure during the winter and the summer and there's no wind, it will most likely be both in Sweden, Denmark, northern parts of Germany, the Baltic states. So it's quite likelihood that it will not be possible to import. In the Swedish analysis, Svenska Kraftnät, the TSO calculates that only about 8 or 9% of the available wind capacity will be available on the peak periods, and I think that would be the same in our neighboring countries.
It sounds like a future problem that really needs a lot of attention. I mean, a lot of the analysis that we've done really leads you to. We apologize for the interruption, and apparently we had a little glitch in our broadcast, but we are now back. And I apologize to Mr. Svenningsson for the interruption. We do have some questions for you. We'll get back to that. But let me give the floor to Mr. Bertrand Magnet. He's senior economist with the IAEA, specialized in energy issues, climate change policy assessment, and broad UN Sustainable Development Agenda. He has over 20 years of experience, including 12 years in international organizations. In addition to the IAEA, he worked previously at the International Energy Agency, our sister agency, the OECD, and now he's working at the IAEA. So, Dr. Magnet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So first of all, let me thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to contribute to your conversation. Thank you for this. What I just want to talk you through today is a consolidation of information we've been doing with colleagues, Henri Payer and Hal Turton, to name them, for the past few months. We've been monitoring developments on electricity markets, and there's a number of lessons, of course, that can be drawn from such data consolidation. Next slide, please. So first of all, unsurprisingly, let me start with demand. And of course, the pandemic has had a very critical effect on how much electricity has been consumed over the last few months. The first chart on the left here, this heat map, puts together a number of country outcomes over the past 3 months, starting mid-March until mid-June. There's no particular reason for this selection of countries except the immediate availability of data. But this representation is useful to understand what the impact has been on a week-to-week basis and relative to 2019 levels. So of course, depending on the severity of the lockdown and depending on the patterns of electricity consumption, you will have a different impact from country to country and from week to week. Sweden, which has not really implemented in lockdown, managed to have a relatively stable electricity consumption throughout the period. But other countries, starting with India, France, the UK, and to a lower extent Brazil, Germany, have seen much deeper impacts in terms of electricity consumption and reduction. And if you look at this chart a bit more carefully, you see that the biggest impact actually occurred towards the beginning of April until mid-April. Overall, one can note about a 10% reduction in electricity demand, but of course, every country has been affected to different extent, sometimes to a much larger extent. Now, what has been the impact on electricity prices? I think several former speakers mentioned the impact in terms of end consumption and the impact on end-use prices. So this is a slightly more restricted selection of markets and countries, but still it's informative to understand what was the impact before the start of the lockdown, and then after the start of the lockdown, again, relative to prices of last year in the corresponding months. And what we've seen before the lockdown, there was already a sharp decrease in electricity prices, simply because of the integration of a lot of renewable capacity over the last few months. Also because of a very mild weather globally. And then this depression in electricity prices actually has only been exacerbated once the lockdown has started. So for example, in France, in Germany, in the UK, you've seen further reductions in electricity prices. And of course, this creates a very challenging environment, both for utilities, which of course see a very deep decrease in their own revenues, but also in terms of financing environment. And of course, this is unlikely to support a very quick transition to electricity, to clean energy and clean electricity deployments. And the reason for the even sharper decrease after the start of the lockdown was essentially the decrease in gas prices, as well as CO2 allowances, in particular in Europe. Next slide, please. Now, if we look a bit more carefully at what happened in different energy mixes, this breaks down the outcomes in terms of nuclear generation, that's the left-hand side of the chart, then the solar and wind generation in the middle, and then other types of renewable generation on the right-hand side. Again, you see very different outcomes from place to place, but there's a number of insights that can be drawn from this. First, I should start saying that, of course, I'm focusing here on low carbon generation just because low carbon generation prevailed during the whole period of lockdown, whereas fossil fuel generation has been hit the hardest. However, even though low carbon electricity and nuclear in particular proved quite resilient, of course, most of operators have seen a decrease in demand in electricity in general, and that has affected generation in many countries. I think it's worth noting here what happened, for instance, in the UK, which is in the middle of the table. At the beginning of the period, you saw a nuclear generation decreasing for the first months of lockdown, and then resuming, in particular after wind generation in England and Scotland started plummeting, right? So I think it's interesting to see how the systems have been operated and how flexible grid operations actually were directed. Next slide, please. Now, it's not all bad in terms of low carbon generation. Of course, you see, I just mentioned this reduction of generation in most countries of the world, but it's another way to look at it and to maybe shine a more positive light on the outcome in terms of low carbon generation is to look at the actual market shares, both for nuclear as well as solar and wind, which were also key players and key contributors to low carbon generation during the period. So this chart brings together countries and groups countries in terms of market shares, both for solar and wind and nuclear. Let me focus on the top right corner, where you have those countries which saw an increase both in terms of nuclear share and an increase in wind and solar generation. And countries like Germany, like France, even though the overall absolute value of generation actually decreased in those countries as well, in terms of market share, you saw a consolidation of low carbon electricity. And that's, of course, a good thing. And that offers a glimpse of what future low carbon energy systems could look like. Conspicuous here is the case of South Korea, which managed to increase its nuclear generation by more than 8% over the period, for instance. So once there is enough low carbon capacity in mixes, then the recent events and the recent pandemic has proven that operators can address the challenges by fostering more flexible operations oftentimes, sometimes at the expense, by the way, of some nuclear operations that we saw in England, where the Sizewell B operations had to be shut down at least temporarily to maintain grid stability. But still, this delivers a positive message. In a number of those countries, you still saw an increase in the market shares of low carbon generation vis-a-vis fossil fuel generation. And if I want to come back to the case of England, there's been a lot of comments around the 67 days without coal generation in England, and a lot of commentators actually stressed the contribution of wind energy in particular. But I think it's fair to say that nuclear played a big share of this as well. Thank you. So next slide, please. Now, I just want to summarize some of those key ideas. I have to say that this was drafted before I got to read your policy brief, but of course this is very much in line with what you have put together yourself. So what we can actually understand from the recent reaction to the pandemic and to the difficulties we've been facing was first that nuclear power generation proved quite resilient, proved reliable and adaptable, irrespective of the different contexts that we've seen in different countries. There has been challenges in terms of maintaining grid stability, and that, of course, followed the decline in fossil fuel generation. But this is, but again, grid operators managed to address the issue, and this is also some sort of experiment. Because this is likely to emerge as more critical in the future when we turn into even more decarbonized mixes. And I think that's what the former speaker from Sweden mentioned as well when he stressed the difficulties to maintain grid stability in Sweden. The current conditions, of course, only emphasize the need to ensure the security of supply, and their nuclear power plants as well as other low carbon technologies, be they variable or not, can alleviate the risk of supply disruptions. But of course, everything needs to be monitored, and there's a lot of experiments and a lot of experiences that have been gained in the last few months in this direction. Now, I think another important point, and I think this is also mentioned in the policy brief that you put together, there is a need for more flexibility in the system and the way the system is being operated. This trend has been accelerated by the crisis, and again, will only be more manifest in future systems in the longer terms. And the topic of today's conversation, of course, is built-in resilience. And this encompasses many dimensions. Resilience that can be understood in terms of physical resilience, in particular with respect to external shocks, starting with more extreme and more frequent climate events and changing weather conditions. But I think there's a lot to say as well in terms of also other sources of potential vulnerabilities that our energy systems will be facing in the future, starting with economic conditions. I think it was meant that the competitiveness issues of the different low carbon sources were discussed. There's a lot of discussion that, in terms of job creation. Of course, the main and the priority now is to kickstart economies again and to restore employment. So this is a major source of vulnerability, and we want to make sure that future systems will also be able to provide this resilience in terms of economic conditions. Then, of course, there is a social dimension to all this, and there's a lot to say and a lot to do to ensure affordability of electricity services. At the IEA, of course, we have a very broad mandate, and we address many countries, some of them in emerging economies, and some of them addressing populations with very low levels of income. So, of course, the affordability is a critical component of how resilient the future systems should be designed. There are regulatory weaknesses that also need to be addressed. And there's a whole, of course, there's a very large now discussion around how to design recovery packages. And that has to provide clear indications in terms of policies, in terms of incentives for investors to focus solely now on low carbon energy sources. And then finally, I want to stress the last point on the financial resilience as well. That calls for the reforms of power markets. It's also mentioned in the policy brief. These issues remain. They were there before the crisis, of course, and they remain critical issues now. But there is an opportunity with the design of those recovery packages to rebuild the entire infrastructure, not only physical again, but soft as well, and to address those multiple vulnerabilities. Just want to say a final remark. All of this material was published yesterday on the IEA website, so you can find this material and the visuals from the main page of the IEA. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to rush this along, but I do have one clarification question. You showed, particularly the case, I think, of the UK, that the wind and solar generation declined quite substantially during the COVID period. Could you clarify what was the cause of that? Was that just order of merit, or was there some operational issue?
Yes. So here I don't want to send the wrong signal and the wrong conclusion. Of course, it's all relative to the starting week of the lockdown in this case. Okay. So I think I wasn't very clear on this. When I showed demand, that was relative to last year, 2019, so year-on-year change. But the low carbon mixes I showed were actually relative to the week prior lockdown, so the week before the 15th of March. And if you look at this, of course, there's a lot of seasonality there, right? And of course, renewables in the UK are favored by priority dispatch. But you still saw some decrease to some extent during some period of time from wind generation in particular.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much. So let me move on to our last speaker, and that's Marianne Evans, who is the Senior Project Manager at EDF R&D. Currently, she is manager of the H2020 EU Sysflex project, and formerly was research director at the Energy Transition Institute at Paris-Saclay.
Thank
Ms.
you very
Evans, the
much,
floor is yours.
Margaret. Thank you for inviting me to present the results, the main findings of our research project, EU Sysflex. So EU Sysflex stands for System Operation and Flexibility Solutions to meet the target of 50% renewables for Europe by 2030. So if we move to the next slide, please, I will give you an overview of the consortium of the project. It's a large consortium with 34 power system players, and it involves technology providers, utilities, but also a lot of transmission system operators, TSOs, and distribution system operators, all involved for 4 years, 4 years, and a demonstration project to demonstrate flexibility solutions to operate the system with high res, renewable energy sources. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So the context of our project, we started by building scenarios for Europe based on the EU reference scenarios of 2030 and 2050. And the idea is transitioning towards higher share of RESI, electrical renewable energy sources for Europe. So as you can see, we'll build a first scenario called energy transition with 52%, and then a more ambitious scenario called renewable ambition with 66% RES for Europe. So the fact that we increase the RES penetration show challenges in several areas. So of course, in terms, because of the intermittency and the variability of these sources, we encounter issues to balance the system in real time at all moments in the system. On top of being variable, these sources are also increasingly, especially as we talk about solar and wind, power electronics interfaced sources. So this added to the variability causes stability issues to the system, to operating the system. It also means rethinking the grid restoration in case of event and blackouts. On top of that, these sources are in majority decentralized, far from the load or the consumption, let's say, areas. So this generates as well, on top of that, a lot of grid constraints and congestion management issues. So next slide, please. In the first 2 years of the project, we have carried out with our partners some advanced simulation in terms of power system dynamics, and to confirm what the issues that the challenges that I was mentioning on the previous slide, and to confirm this by this simulation and quantify the issues and the scarcities that we are and will be encountering when increasing the res share. So on the figure here, I won't comment all the details, but we've identified, and it's already showing in reds to be already present scarcities in systems such as the Irish system, which is a smaller system compared, of course, with Europe, that has less interconnection with the rest of continental Europe, and which has a very high share of wind. So we already see balancing and stability issues at high res, and in particular when we look at the non-synchronous share penetration. And so it's already experienced in smaller systems such as Ireland, but what we can see as well is that's a raising concern as well for continental Europe. It's in the best of case an evolving characteristic at present, and surely it's showing to be a real concern in 2030, where we're pushing the shares of non-synchronous. So we confirmed by calculation and simulations the balancing and stability issues. We confirmed we could see as well with our models connected to grid models of several system operators the increase in terms of congestion. So congestion cross borders, because as our Swedish colleague was saying, there are a lot of exchanges between countries, and so we see the interconnections being saturated in some cases, unscheduled flows as well that we have to deal with, and that are proving very challenging, and also the needs between TSO and DSO, because a large part of renewables are connected to the distribution system. So we have increased congestion as well inside the distributed system. And as I was telling earlier on, so rethinking completely the system restoration process, because the units that were involved in the restoration process are not present on the grid anymore. So if we move to the next slide, please. So the technical, some technical scarcities are clearly appearing in this high-res context. And as well as those technical challenges, economics challenges are showing as well. So clear financial gaps are appearing in our scenarios and market models. So as we can see with investment in a lot of capacity as well as networks, we have a structure of costs that changes. The operating costs are decreasing, but the capital costs and fixed costs are making the overwhelming share of the structure of costs. In addition of the building of res capacity, our system adequacy needs mean that some conventionals are still needed, and more conventionals are also being built, especially gas turbines, to maintain the system adequacy. So we have a high share of capital and fixed costs. At the same time, the revenues for all sources, not only conventional sources for which the revenues are dropping because the load factors are lower, but also the revenues for res are going down. So the energy prices are going down, and even increase even further because we have a cannibalization effect when the share of resi is increasing. So between revenues going down and capital and fixed costs going up, we have a financial gaps that is appearing, and that creates also investment risk. On top of that, when we have high-res context, and here we have the present example for Germany on the figure at the bottom, curtailment is needed as a flexibility solution to manage the increasing congestion. So on top of feed-in tariffs and compensation payments, we have increased redispatch costs for the system operators, and as well as reinforcement for the grids. So we have increasing costs here as well. So what it shows in brief is that present market design are clearly not adapted for the clean energy target for Europe. The energy and flexibility prices are low and mainly decreasing, so it really challenges the EU target, but also the decarbonization targets, clean energy and decarbonization targets. So if we can please move to the next slide. So the energy and flexibility markets need to reflect, if we want to change and transition to this new system, they need to reflect this new functioning, this new paradigm. So what we see happening in this energy transition is very much more flexibility is needed. So it's needed from the remaining conventionals, which can prove challenging for some technology. And also for the economics of those technologies. but also we need more flexibility from new flexibility providers. So new players such as storage, but also system services coming as well from the renewables. And to accompany this, an innovative design of services is needed with faster reserves, with an increased granularity in reserves and larger volumes and much closer to real time. So in terms of operation and design of the markets, this is quite a big issue to tackle and to implement. As I was saying, a lot of this new generation and new flexibilities, because part of storage can be distributed, they're embedded in the distribution system, which was not designed for it. And so a lot of, well, development of smart distributed grids, but also data exchange and a lot of coordination, exchange of data, of forecasting, generation forecasting, weather forecasting, consumption forecasting. So all these exchanges and coordination is really crucial between the TSO and the DSOs. So what we see for sure is investments in generation and generation of the future system, in flexibilities that are really needed, but also in networks reinforcement if we want to continue on connecting decentralized assets, new components in operating the system, and smart devices, not only on the grids, but in the demand side, as demand can prove flexible as well. So these investments need to be discussed and secured as soon as possible by clear and stable signals. So that's the challenge for the future market and regulation to accompany the energy transition. So finally, if we can move to the last slide, please. So here you have a resume, let's say a summary of what we're doing and trying to tackle in the project. So studying the project with increasing share of res and over 50% renewable energy. With accompanied by the development of storage to tackle parts of the variability issue of these renewables. Also the smarter uses in the demand side. And we're trying to tackle the challenges and technical challenges that I've mentioned earlier to operate the system in security, which is absolutely essential. And at the same time, this is coupled with market issues that I was talking about. We have a lot of work, but that is still in progress, so I couldn't talk about it today, on data management as well and operator policies. The demonstrations, we have 7 demonstrations up and running to show that some of these solutions are already working and ready to go on the market and used by system operators, and also qualifying trials processes to show and prove that some new technologies can provide the needed flexibility solution. And all that will lead at the end of the project in 2 years' time in a roadmap to address the future system operation complexities in a high-res future. So if you have questions, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me just ask one question. I apologize to everyone. We're going to run a little bit over time, but I'll just ask a few questions. We'll wrap up. But you highlighted that a lot of these issues on frequency control and other issues arise at the higher shares of renewables. And I think you were noting, I think your analysis looked at 66%, as I think I saw on one of your slides.
Yeah.
That's the 2 questions about that. First, that's not as high as some countries in Europe have been discussing regarding renewable future. And secondly, can you comment on that? And if 66% is, in your view, a very high ambition, where is the rest of the electricity coming from?
Okay, so first of all, the scenario here, it was just a summary, so it's 66% for the whole of Europe, and we have 28 countries that are in our model. So some of them have higher shares, and some of them have lower shares. So the 60% is really country dependent. Okay, for example, Ireland, who is a major partner in the project, is reaching 70%, and some countries have much lower share at present, and even in their 2030 targets. So that's part of your question. On top of that, this is renewable, so not all of it is variable renewable. Okay, some countries have large hydro, some countries are developing biomass, and this proves these technologies are a bit less challenging than the variable and non-synchronous sources. So the challenges can be different from one country to another.
So when you look over Europe and you say 66%, and that includes hydro, that was another question I was going to have. So where is the other 34% coming from? Is that what's
so we have decreasing share of coal and in general fossil fuels. In the 2050 scenarios, the share of nuclear is decreasing a little bit, but not that much. And the share of gas is more or less stable.
Okay, so it's not a zero carbon scenario by 2050.
It's not a zero carbon. It's
Okay.
low carbon, but it's not zero carbon. And I forgot to mention, but you have all the detailed results of the models and all the reports. They are public, and you can find them on the USysFlex website.
Well, thank you very much. And your analysis seems to resonate quite nicely with the systems analysis that we have been doing. So I'm sure Sam is thinking the same thing. I think there's clearly a dialogue here that we need to have. Well, let me just ask a few questions. And again, I apologize, we're going to run a few minutes over. But let me go back to Mr. Spinningson, because I'd like to get your reaction to what you just heard from the presentation regarding this future scenario. And of course, Sweden has the advantage of having a lot of hydro, so that helps stabilize the situation a great deal. But when you look at the overall situation in Europe, how do you see this scenario playing out?
I think we will take several steps forward and integrate much more renewables. That's clear, and I think that is positive, especially when we phase out coal. That is very positive. But I think what it is like this elephant in the room that we really never talk enough about is like what is the total impact of this, the total system cost. We're trying to almost disregard the possibilities of nuclear. We're trying to push in our policies and in our discussions all arguments how we should be able to integrate a significant share of renewables and still, as we concluded, not come to a zero carbon situation. And I think we don't have that time. I mean, we have Greta Thunberg coming from Sweden, and I would say we need to take the climate crisis really seriously. And I think we, both as an industry, but policymakers, politics, really need to look at nuclear as one of the solutions to this. And I think we are putting so much money and so much effort into integrate a share of renewables that is, from my point of view, probably too large. So I think we need to put that on the table to have nuclear valued as well as other technologies. We can see in Germany, it was pointed out here, the cost for balancing services, for example. And I think with the COVID-19 crisis, the financial crisis upon that, will we have the money to spend? We as an industry also need to work with getting construction costs down, getting which you have pointed to in your policies, because if nuclear should be an alternative, we cannot just point to that we are as good as the other ones on the system level. We actually need to become even cheaper. So I think we as an industry also need to work more with our cost base and financial base. So it's good intentions, good wishes, but I think we need to get nuclear back on the table to be really serious about climate change.
I mean, Mr. Kovacs, I suspect you agree with that.
I largely agree with the Swedish colleagues, and in addition to that, it seems that in Europe, at least, there are two how to say, two different issues are progressing in a different direction. One is the centralization of the inhabitants and the public into large cities, while we parallelly diversifying the electricity supply. And I'm not sure if it's the right approach taken that much. I mean, it clearly won't be the most efficient from an economic point of view.
Salma, let me ask you to comment on this, because I mean, whenever the NEA analysis goes forward, it always seems clear that the path is a nuclear renewables path. And it seems like every serious analysis that we see really reinforces that. How do you see the combination or the connection of what the work that you've done in the systems cost area and some of the other analyses fitting with the analysis you saw from Marianne?
No, I think that they are very much aligned, I think. So we obviously, I mean, the analysis that they've done is very nuanced in the sense that includes a lot of the data, including a specific generation for the specific countries. And as you know, our analysis are a little bit more, we took what is like a generic country, not so much the specific data as much as Marianne's analysis has. But I think that the results are very much in line. And I think that everybody, most analyses actually show exactly that. This very good partnership between nuclear and renewable energy sources, if we really want to achieve this low carbon society or this zero carbon society that we are looking at the future. So yes, we are very much aligned.
I have one question from the audience I wanted to pass on to Mr. Magnet. When considering electricity prices, should not it be necessary to differentiate market prices and who is benefiting from them versus the end consumer taxpayer prices that would include all the subsidies to variable renewables? You want to try to give a response to that?
Well, yeah, that's a tough one, of course. I mean, there's a lot to do to reform the way prices are designed. I mean, currently, obviously, the context is not very favorable to large-scale deployment of renewables and nuclear in particular. There's a lack of policy incentives. There's a difficulty to finance. And of course, current prices do not provide the right incentives for this. But, you know, I mean, I think in your policy brief, one of the keywords that caught my attention was complementarity. And the moment policymakers will recognize the complementarity of the different low carbon options, they would be able to design prices and price schemes in accordance, of course. But we evolve in a very fast moving policy landscape. There's a lot of momentum around recovery packages. It's the moment actually to address both affordability issues from the end use side of things, and also having more conducive costs and cost reflective tariffs for operators and financiers. So now is the time really to put things together, to sit around the table and to design the future schemes that will actually allow for the deployment of this low carbon electricity.
Thank you. And we are way over time, but I want to give President Velshi a final comment. And let me ask this question, which is, and listening to this conversation, and trust me, I understand the role of the regulator in the middle of all this, but regulators are not oblivious to what's going on in terms of the economic pressures on industry, the discussion about the energy transition. In that context, it's very important for regulators to be nimble, to be efficient, and also to be very conscious of cost and schedule. And I wonder, can you give us a perspective on that, as particularly because there's been so much discussion in Canada about new nuclear and extending the lives of existing plants. Do you see that? Do you think the regulators can do business? And we already talked about they can't do business in terms of public communications the old way, but can regulators do business with the industry in the old way, or do you think we're on the threshold of more change there as well?
I think we're on the threshold for more change, and some has come to the forefront with the pandemic, where certainly here in Canada, but just across the world, where regulators have had to operate remotely and carry out our oversight remotely, and that has meant greater dependency on the licensees in providing us information. And I think that's just kind of a change of relationship where there is greater codependency on certain things. That doesn't mean that it should in any way undermine our independence, but that there's a recognition that we need to collaborate more. So that's from an oversight perspective. I think with the pandemic, where we've looked at how can we as regulators be more flexible, whether it's around exemptions or exceptions on regulatory requirements, it's also forced us to look at those and saying, in the long term, should we be revisiting those, and are those really required in the long term? Now, there have been very, very few of those, but I think it's just, as part of our, just for the whole sector on continuous learning and improvements, it's just another lens. And when it comes to new nuclear, and you and I have had a number of discussions around that, is how can regulators make sure that we're not an impediment to innovation or progress? And that includes not only on how we can be more effective in carrying out our oversight, but are we also nimble, and are we as risk informed as we should be? And just because we did things a certain way in the past, these are new technologies with new risks, new requirements, new approaches, and we need to make sure that we're approaching it with that lens. It's not what we did with big reactors and reducing it. It isn't. It's just a novel way of looking at things.
Complete agreement on my side. Well, thank you, President Velshi, and thank all of you for joining us today. This has been a very interesting discussion. More discussion to come. Certainly some new ideas and new things for me to pursue after talking with you. So, President Velshi, I'll be giving you a call. There's a conversation I think I just thought we should have. But many of the rest of you, thank you very much for being with us today.